And here in Colorado, we wonder what the mental health effects of taking part or even watching these protests is. Who is most at risk? And what should we be watching for as a signal that it might be impacting us? Here to discuss the scientific data on the psychiatric impact of the protest is our 9 health expert, Dr. Payal Kohli. Good morning.
Hi, John. Good morning.
Let's start with what do we know right now about the mental health effects of these protests and riots on our community?
So it's interesting, in January of this year, before all this actually started, there was a meta-analysis published in the Australian and New Zealand Journal of Psychiatry. And a meta-analysis is basically a combination of many smaller studies to look for trends. So they combined 52 studies from 20 different countries, and they included protests, riots, and revolutions, which they called collective action. And they looked to see which were the side effects that were most likely to emerge from this. And interestingly enough, PTSD and depression were the 2 most common things to emerge as a result of these protests. Now, really, you could react in any way, but these were the 2 most common. And this was very similar pattern to what we see with natural disasters or other terrorist acts. When you actually quantify it, PTSD incidence was 4 to 41% in affected areas. So just think about that for a second. That means up to 4 out of every 10 people that live in the community, such as in Denver, could have post-traumatic stress disorder from something like the protests. They also looked at the major depressive disorder, and the incidence of that was increased by 7%. And interestingly enough, you don't actually have to be participating in the protest to be affected and have a higher incidence. Now, what was also very, very thought-provoking was that 2 out of the 52 studies actually showed a positive mental impact of the riots and protests, lower depression, lower risk of suicide, and they postulated that there may have been something cathartic about the act of protesting and the social togetherness from the protests.
That's interesting that there's the 2 sides to that. What are some of the things that we should be looking for if this is affecting our mental health? Are there some risks out there?
Yeah, so certain people are at higher risk, and some of those are, as you may imagine, if you're in a lower socioeconomic status, which we know a lot of the protesters going out there are. If you're in close proximity to the violence or it directly affects you, like your business gets looted, you have trouble with, interpersonal relationships, or your social network is not there. Those are obvious. The ones that I was a little surprised to see were female sex. That's a higher risk factor. Not having children is a higher risk factor. And social media use. So if you're on social media more, you're more likely to be affected by these protests.
What would you recommend for those attending these protests or even watching them?
Yeah, it's such a difficult time. We first had the pandemic and the stresses of that to deal with, and the protests came on top of that. So I would say the most important thing you can do is be vigilant for symptoms. Look for changes in mood, in your sleep patterns, in substance abuse, anything that might signal that you might be headed in the wrong direction, because catching it early is really going to help to prevent that cycle. And then think about cutting down your social media use, because I know it's hard and we want to stay up to date with everything, and that's how we communicate, but that may actually really impact your ability to react to the protests in a natural manner.
Always great advice. Thank you so much, 9 health expert Dr. Payal Kohli. We appreciate that. Let's head on over to Marty for